She arrived with nothing but a baby on her hip and a lie she never told. She just forgot to mention the child. When the rancher saw that infant, his face went cold as the Montana sky in November, and he told her to get out by morning. She had no money, no family, no second chance waiting anywhere on earth. And then the snow came down so hard and so fast that leaving became impossible. One night. That's all fate gave her. One night to make a man who'd buried everyone he ever loved remember what it felt like to need someone to come home to. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like, and stay with me until the very end. The wagon hit a rut deep enough to jolt Evelyn Hartwell straight off the bench, and she grabbed the sideboard with one hand and Rose with the other before either of them could go tumbling into the frozen mud. The driver, a leathery old man named Garrett, who hadn't spoken more than 11 words since Billings, didn't even flinch. He just kept his eyes on the rutted trail and let the horses find their own footing through the October cold. "Sorry," he said. It was word number 12. Evelyn repositioned Rose against her shoulder and pulled the wool blanket tighter around them both. The baby was awake but quiet, which was unusual. Rose had been fussing off and on since dawn, picking up on her mother's nerves the way infants always did, like little barometers for everything the adults around them were trying to hide. But now she'd gone still, her dark eyes fixed on the pale strip of sky above the canyon walls, and Evelyn was grateful for it. She needed the quiet to think. She was 23 years old. She had $4.60 in the pocket of her coat. She had a 6-month-old daughter, a single trunk of belongings, and a letter from a man named Caleb Mercer confirming her position as cook at the Mercer Cattle Ranch outside a place called Harlan Creek, Montana. She had not mentioned Rose in her application. She had not mentioned Rose in any of her 3 letters to Mr. Mercer. She had told herself this was a practical decision, that a rancher advertising for a cook wanted to know about her cooking, not her personal circumstances. That once she arrived and he saw the quality of her work, the presence of one small, well-behaved baby would be a minor footnote. She had been telling herself this for 6 weeks, and she was no longer sure she believed it. The wagon crested a low ridge, and suddenly the Mercer Ranch spread out below them in the fading afternoon light. It was bigger than she'd imagined. A main house built from dark timber with a wide front porch, a bunkhouse set back behind it, a massive barn with a weather vane shaped like a running horse, and a series of outbuildings scattered across the property like punctuation marks. A creek threaded through the near pasture, ice-edged and running slow. In the far distance, cattle moved like dark stitches across a pale canvas of frost-bitten grass. It was, she had to admit, beautiful in the way that hard, unapologetic things often were. Garrett pulled the horses to a stop at the gate. "End of the line," he said. Words 13 and 14. Evelyn climbed down without help, which took a moment because she had Rose in one arm and her balance was not what it used to be. Hadn't been, really, since the pregnancy. She landed in the mud and straightened up, squared her shoulders, and looked at the house. Smoke came from the chimney. The front door was closed. "Thank you," she told Garrett. He tipped his hat and turned the wagon around without another word. She stood at the gate and listened to the wheels fade and watched the empty road for a moment longer than she needed to. And then she picked up her trunk, awkwardly, one-handed, with Rose balanced on her hip, and walked toward the front door of a house that didn't know she existed yet. She knocked 3 times, waited, knocked again. The door opened, and the man who stood in the frame was not what she had expected from his letters. Caleb Mercer's correspondence had been efficient and somewhat formal, and she had constructed in her mind a man of middle age, perhaps with a slight stoop, the kind of quiet domestic rancher who advertised for cooks because he'd grown tired of his own. The man in front of her was maybe 30, broad through the shoulders, dark hair pushed back from his forehead like he'd been running his hand through it all afternoon. He was wearing a canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and his jaw had a few days of dark stubble on it, and his eyes were the gray-green color of river water in November. He looked at her face first, a quick, assessing look, and then his gaze dropped, and he went completely still. Rose looked back at him. Rose was not an unpleasant-looking baby. She had her father's dark eyes and Evelyn's square jaw, and at 6 months she'd developed a habit of fixing strangers with an extremely serious stare, as if she were deciding something important about them. She was doing it now. Her small fist was curled around the collar of Evelyn's coat, and she was regarding Caleb Mercer with the full weight of her attention. He said nothing. Evelyn said, "Mr. Mercer, I'm Evelyn Hartwell. We corresponded about the cook position." He pulled his eyes from the baby to her face. Something had changed in his expression. It wasn't anger exactly, not yet. It was closer to the look of a man who had just stepped on a nail he knew was there and had gone ahead and stepped on it anyway. "You have a child," he said. "I do. This is Rose. She's 6 months old and she's very—" "You didn't mention a child." "No, I didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind came down off the ridge behind her and pushed cold air against the back of her neck. "Why not?" he said. She could have given him any number of soft answers. She could have apologized and deflected and smiled and made the thing smaller than it was. Instead, she said, "Because I needed this position, and I was afraid you'd turn me away." That was the whole truth, and she knew it landed differently than a softer answer would have. She watched him register it. He wasn't pleased. She could see that clearly enough. But he wasn't pretending either, and somehow she thought that mattered. He stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold. We'll talk inside." The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, which was the first thing she noticed, and the second thing she noticed was that it was a disaster. Not dirty, exactly, but neglected. The kind of room where things had been allowed to pile up over a long period of time by someone who was managing the necessities and nothing else. Dishes stacked but not properly put away. A cast iron skillet with what looked like the remnants of last week's supper still crusted on the bottom. Flour dusted across the counter near the bread box. The wood stove was burning fine, but the chimney pipe had a rattle to it that suggested it hadn't been cleaned since spring. The rest of the house, what she could see of it through the doorway, looked about the same. Caleb pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. "Sit down," he said, and went to pour coffee from the pot on the stove. She sat, settling Rose on her lap. The baby had gone back to her serious examination of the world, turning her head to look at the ceiling beams, and then at the wood stove, and then at the man pouring coffee with his back to her. He set a mug in front of Evelyn and leaned against the counter. He didn't take coffee for himself. "Here's where I stand," he said. "I hired a cook. That's what I need. I've got 7 men in that bunkhouse who need 3 meals a day, and I've been feeding them out of cans and whatever the last cook left in the pantry before she quit, which is not a situation I care to continue. I needed someone who could work hard and start immediately." "I can do that," Evelyn said. "What I did not need," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "is a baby." Rose chose this moment to make a soft sound, not crying, just a small conversational noise she'd developed lately, and Caleb's eyes dropped to her briefly. "She doesn't interfere," Evelyn said. "She's a good baby. Quiet, mostly. I've been managing her on my own for 6 months, and she doesn't slow my work." "It's not about whether she slows your work." He pushed off from the counter and walked to the window. Outside, the light was going flat and gray. "It's the arrangement. It's what I was promised and what was delivered. I offered a position to a cook. 1 person. I've got room in the back of the house for 1 person." Evelyn looked at the coffee mug in her hands. The ceramic was chipped at the rim. She thought about the $4.60 in her coat pocket. She thought about the wagon that had already turned around and driven away. She thought about Harlan Creek, which was nothing more than a supply store and a church from what Garrett had told her. Not a place where a woman with a baby and almost no money was going to find a soft landing. "I understand your frustration," she said carefully. "It's not frustration," he said, turning from the window. "It's a plain fact. You weren't honest with me. That's a problem." "You're right. It is a problem. And I'm not going to argue with you about that." She looked up at him. "But I'd ask you to consider what it means for me to have come this far with no guarantee of anything except a letter saying a job might exist. A letter you obtained under false pretenses. I gave you my name and my qualifications and my experience, and none of that was a lie. I have cooked for a household of 9. I can bake bread, I can put up preserves, I can butcher a chicken and smoke a ham and feed a crew of men until they can't stand straight. The only thing I didn't tell you was that I had a daughter." He was quiet. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said. "I'm asking for a fair chance to show you what I can do. Give me 1 week. If at the end of it you still want me gone, I'll go." He crossed his arms over his chest. You have nowhere to go. That's true. And you're telling me that anyway. Yes. He looked at her for a moment that stretched out long and uncomfortable. Then he looked at Rose, who was looking back at him with her usual profound seriousness. I have a room off the kitchen, he said finally. Small, not fit for much. It'll be fine. I'm not making any promises about the length of the arrangement. I understand. And the child is your responsibility. Not mine, not the crew's. Yours. Completely. He uncrossed his arms and moved toward the door. I'll show you the room. Supper was supposed to be at 6. You've got an hour. Mr. Mercer. He stopped in the doorway. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said, and walked out. The room off the kitchen was not small. It was tiny. It had a narrow bed, a hook on the wall, a single window that looked out on the side yard, and a smell of old wood and dust. There was no bureau, no chair. Evelyn set her trunk against the wall and stood in the center of the room with Rose on her hip and looked around at what she'd bought herself with 6 weeks of careful letters and 1,200 miles of travel. Well, she said to her daughter, it's not much. Rose patted her cheek with one small hand. You're right, Evelyn said. We've seen worse. She had seen worse. The room she'd rented in Denver after Hank died was barely bigger than a closet, and it had a window that faced a brick wall and a landlady who knocked on the door every 3rd day asking about money. She had stayed in that room for 4 months, nursing a newborn and doing piecework by lamplight and trying to figure out what came next. What came next had turned out to be an advertisement in the back of a newspaper. Cook needed, Montana ranch, room and board provided, good wages for qualified woman, and the slow, desperate calculation that she had nothing to lose by trying. She laid Rose on the narrow bed and took off her coat. Then she went back to the kitchen. She had 1 hour, and she intended to use it. The pantry, at least, was reasonably stocked. Whoever had managed the supplies before her had known their business. There were sacks of flour and dried beans, sides of cured bacon, jars of preserved tomatoes, a crock of lard, cornmeal, dried onions, a wheel of hard cheese. She found potatoes in a bin in the corner and carrots in another. In the cold cabinet off the back porch, there was a haunch of venison that smelled fresh, no more than a day or 2 old. She made a decision quickly, the way she always did in kitchens, which was one of the few places in her life where she trusted her instincts without question. Venison stew, cornbread, the last of a jar of apple preserve she found on the top shelf. She got the stove burning hot, got the venison cut and browning while she broke down the vegetables, got the cornbread batter mixed, and into the pan. She found a second cast iron pot and got it seasoned and hung over the fire. She cleaned the kitchen as she worked. Not a full cleaning, not tonight, but enough to establish order. Washing the stacked dishes and putting them away properly, wiping down the counter, setting the table with the mismatched plates she found in the cupboard. Rose fussed once, about 40 minutes in. Evelyn dried her hands, went to the room, nursed her for 10 minutes, settled her back on the bed, and returned to the kitchen without breaking the stew's rhythm. At 6 o'clock, she rang the dinner bell she found hanging by the back door. She had never met these men before. She didn't know their names or their temperaments, or whether they'd be resentful of a stranger in their kitchen. She stood at the stove and kept her face neutral when the back door opened and boots hit the floor and men filed in. 7 of them, rough and tired, smelling of cold air and cattle and a long day's work. They stopped at the threshold when they registered the smell. One of them actually closed his eyes. Lord above, said a stocky man with a red beard. Is that actual food? Venison stew, Evelyn said. Cornbread. Sit down before it cools. They sat down. They ate with the focused silence of men who had been eating badly for a while and intended to make up for it. The one with the red beard, who introduced himself as Pete, the ranch foreman, had 2 full bowls and then looked at the pot as if calculating whether a third would be inappropriate. Go ahead, Evelyn told him. He had the 3rd bowl. Caleb came in at 6:10, later than the rest. He sat at the head of the table and took the bowl she put in front of him without comment. She watched him take the first spoonful from the corner of her eye and saw something happen in his expression. A brief, involuntary relaxation around the jaw, the way a person looks when something is better than they were prepared for. He didn't say anything. He ate. He cleaned the bowl. When he was done, he pushed back from the table and went to the door and stopped. 6 o'clock breakfast, he said without turning around. 4:30, if you can manage it. I'll manage it, she said. He went out. Pete caught her eye from across the table and gave her a small nod that meant something. She wasn't sure exactly what, but it felt like the beginning of an ally. That night, after the dishes were done and the kitchen was clean, and Rose was asleep in the narrow room, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed in her coat because the room had gone cold, and she let herself feel for a moment the full weight of what she'd done and where she'd landed. It wasn't stability. It wasn't even close to safe. A man who'd hired her under what he correctly identified as false pretenses, 7 strangers, a ranch at the end of a rutted road in a state she'd never been to before, and winter coming down from the mountains like a slow, inevitable hammer. But it was a kitchen. It was a job. It was a room. She lay down next to her daughter in the narrow bed and pulled the blanket over them both, and listened to the wind building outside the window, and thought about Hank. Not the way she usually thought about him, which was sharp and painful and cut right to the center of her chest, but in a different way. Softer. She thought about the way he used to come in from the mine in the evenings, dirty and tired, and how he'd always knock the mud off his boots before he came through the door because she'd asked him to once and he never forgot. Small thing. She missed it still. Rose made a sound in her sleep, a small sighing sound, deeply contented, and Evelyn curled her arm around her daughter and closed her eyes. Tomorrow was going to be hard. Tomorrow she had to prove herself all over again, and the day after that, and probably every day after that for as long as this lasted. She was 23. She'd learned to be tired. She was up at 4. The kitchen was cold. She had the stove going within 5 minutes, and by the time the first gray light was bleeding through the window, she had a pot of coffee on, biscuits in the pan, and a cast-iron skillet of bacon and salt pork getting crisp over the fire. She could hear movement in the bunkhouse when she stepped out for wood. Boots on floorboards, low voices, the clank of something metal. The men were waking up. She carried the wood inside and built the fire higher and went back to the biscuits and tried not to think about whether Caleb Mercer was already regretting his decision. There was nothing she could do about what he thought except work. So she worked. He came into the kitchen at 4:50. She had his coffee poured and on the table before he'd fully closed the door behind him. He stopped, looked at the table, looked at the coffee. Looked at her. "You're early," he said. "You said 4:30 if I could manage it. I didn't expect you actually would." "I know," she said, and turned back to the stove. He sat and drank the coffee, and she felt him watching the kitchen, looking at the order of it, the cleanliness, the stove burning right, and the biscuits going golden and the counter free of last night's mess. "Who taught you to cook?" he asked. It was the first question he'd asked her that wasn't about the terms of her employment. She considered it. "My mother," she said. "Then necessity." He was quiet a moment. "Your mother's gone?" "Yes, a few years ago." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She pulled the biscuits from the oven. He watched her set them to cool on the rack. "The room's too cold," he said. She turned to look at him. "The one off the kitchen. I noticed last night the stove doesn't throw heat far enough to reach it. There's another room on the second floor, south-facing, smaller but warmer. You'd be better off there." She thought about the $4.60. She thought about standing at the door last night telling him she had nowhere to go. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "It's practical," he said. "A sick baby's no good to anyone." He picked up his coffee and went out to check on the horses, and she stood in the kitchen holding the pan of biscuits and thought that was probably as close to kindness as Caleb Mercer got, and that it was more than she'd expected. Well, October hardened into a thing that had teeth. The days settled into a rhythm that Evelyn built herself, piece by piece, the way she'd always built things, quietly, consistently, without waiting for permission. Breakfast at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6. She learned the men's names: Pete, the red-bearded foreman who was unexpectedly gentle about everything that wasn't livestock; young Danny, barely 17, who ate like he was still growing and probably was; Walt, who'd been with Caleb for years and spoke in a slow, deliberate way that made everything he said feel considered; Tom and his brother Cade, who finished each other's sentences without seeming to notice; older Eli, who'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand to some past accident and still had the best roping arm on the ranch, and Reed, who was handsome in a careless way and knew it and used it mostly to dodge kitchen cleanup rotation. She figured them all out inside a week. The food she made was not fancy. It was never fancy. She had no illusions about that, and she had no interest in them. What she made was solid and well-seasoned and plentiful, and she made it consistently, which was more than anyone was used to. After the first week, Pete started coming in 10 minutes early for every meal, which she suspected had less to do with hunger than with having somewhere warm to sit, and she never mentioned it. Rose, for her part, adapted to the ranch with the philosophical acceptance of the very young. She slept in the warmer upstairs room in a drawer Evelyn had padded with blankets. The cradle could wait, she kept telling herself. The cradle was a luxury. And during the days she spent most of her time in a basket Evelyn positioned near the kitchen stove, watching the ceiling and chewing on her own fist, and occasionally producing opinions about things that seemed to concern only herself. The men were shy about her at first. They'd glance at the basket and look quickly away, like men who suspect they're being watched and aren't sure how they feel about it. But Rose had no interest in being ignored, and she had a way of locking eyes with a person and maintaining that contact until they either acknowledged her or left the room. And men who spent all day chasing cattle across open range were, as it turned out, less capable of withstanding the direct gaze of a 6-month-old than you might expect. It was Danny who broke first. He came in one afternoon for coffee and found himself 3 feet from Rose's basket, and Rose staring at him, and he said, "She always look at you like that?" And Evelyn said, "Yes." And Danny said, "It's like she's deciding something." And Evelyn said, "She is." And Danny crouched down and said, "Hey there, little bit." And Rose grabbed his offered finger with both hands, and Danny looked up at Evelyn with an expression of complete surprise, as if he had not expected a baby to be both small and strong, and after that he stopped being shy about it. Pete was next, then Walt, then old Eli, who held Rose for approximately 30 seconds before handing her carefully back and saying, "She's all right," which from Eli was essentially a glowing endorsement. Tom and Cade came in as a unit, which made sense. Reed held out the longest, but Evelyn caught him talking to the basket one morning when he thought she was in the pantry, telling Rose in a low voice that she needed to stop staring at him, or he was going to start thinking she expected something. Caleb, she noticed, kept his distance. But he was not unkind. She wanted to be fair about that. He was not cold to her the way he'd been that first evening. The door-in-the-face coldness of a man who'd felt deceived. He was professional, businesslike. He ate what she cooked and said it was good in the same matter-of-fact tone he used to say the north fence needed mending. He answered her questions about supplies and schedules. He told her when he expected the crew back late and when he'd need meals packed for the range. But he did not sit in the kitchen the way the others did. He did not linger after meals. He came and went with the efficiency of a man who had learned somewhere that the safest way to live was to need as little as possible. She wondered about this. She watched him the way she watched everything in her life, sideways, without letting on that she was watching. And she built a picture of him from small things, the way he treated the horses, which was careful and consistent, the way you treated something that mattered. The fact that the ranch was well maintained despite the kitchen's neglect. The structural things, the fences and the barn and the equipment, all kept up. The ledger she'd seen open on the table in the front room, neat columns in a precise hand. A man who managed well. A man who did not let things fall apart. But also, a man who ate supper at a table full of people and was somehow alone in the middle of it. She'd met that kind of alone before. She recognized the shape of it. The fight happened on a Thursday, 2 weeks in. She was pulling bread from the oven when she heard raised voices from the yard, Pete and Reed, which surprised her because Pete did not raise his voice. She went to the window and saw them squared off near the water trough, Pete's face red and Reed's jaw set, and something ugly in the air between them. She heard the word baby float in through the glass. And then distraction. And then she heard Caleb's voice, sharp and flat, cutting across both of them. "Enough!" They went quiet. She watched Caleb say something to Reed, too low for her to catch through the window, and watched Reed's face change from defiant to something less comfortable. Reed said something back, short, and then walked away toward the barn. Caleb watched him go and then turned and looked directly at the kitchen window. He saw her standing there. She didn't pretend she hadn't been watching. She just looked back at him. He held her gaze for a moment and then turned and followed Reed toward the barn. At dinner, Reed was quiet. He ate without complaint and cleared his own plate afterward, which he had never once done voluntarily. She didn't ask what was said. She didn't need to. Pete, passing through the kitchen later, stopped by the stove and said, "Don't worry about Reed. He's got a mouth on him, but he's not bad." "I'm not worried about Reed," she said. "Good." He picked up a biscuit from the cooling rack and took a bite. "Good stew today." "There's more in the pot." "I know," he said, and went to get it. The snow came on a Sunday evening in the last week of October, which was early, even for Montana. It started as sleet around 4 o'clock, while Evelyn was making supper. She noticed it against the window and thought nothing of it. October weather in Montana changed its mind the way a restless sleeper changed position, constantly, without pattern. But by 5 o'clock, it had shifted to something heavier, and by the time she rang the bell for supper, the yard was already white, and the visibility had dropped to the edge of the outbuildings. The men came in stomping snow off their boots, more animated than usual. "Coming down hard," Danny said, shaking his hat out at the door. "How's it looking?" she asked. "Bad," Pete said shortly. "Could be worse by morning." Caleb was the last in. He went to the window before he sat down, standing there looking out at the whitening dark. "The cattle?" Evelyn asked, though it wasn't really her business. "North pasture," he said. "They'll be fine unless this keeps up." He paused. "It's going to keep up." Supper was quieter than usual. She noticed the men eating faster, the way people ate when they expected to need their energy. After, when the others had gone back to the bunkhouse, she was washing the dishes, and Caleb was still at the table with his coffee, and the window behind him filling up with white. "Mr. Mercer," she said, not turning from the sink. "Caleb," he said. It was the first time he'd offered his name. She turned to look at him. "Caleb, is this going to be a problem?" He looked at the window. "Probably." "Should I do anything different for breakfast, in case you need to?" "Put on extra," he said. "The men will need it before they go out." He pushed back from the table and stood. "And I told you could leave in the morning if the arrangement wasn't working." She waited. "That was before this hit," he said. "In this storm, you stay. It's not safe." "I wasn't planning to go anywhere." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but something near it. As if he'd expected her to treat the exit as real. "All right," he said. "Good night, then." "Good night," she said. She turned back to the dishes and listened to his footsteps cross the floor and go up the stairs. Outside, the snow was building against the windowsill, patient and relentless. And Rose was asleep upstairs, and the fire was burning low and steady, and Evelyn Hartwell stood in someone else's kitchen and thought that she didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, for tonight at least, she had everything she needed. She finished the dishes, she banked the fire, she turned out the lamp, she climbed the stairs to her daughter in the warm room, and the snow covered everything outside, and the world went quiet. Morning came in white and brutal. She was up at 4, as always, but the darkness outside the window had a different quality to it. Heavy, muffled, the kind of darkness that meant the world was buried. When she got the kitchen fire going and looked out, she couldn't see the barn. 3 feet of snow had fallen overnight, and it was still coming down, and the wind had risen and was driving it in horizontal sheets across the yard. She started breakfast. There was nothing else to do. The men came in at 5 looking like they'd already been fighting something. Their faces were red and wind-burned, and they moved carefully, the way men moved when they were already cold and didn't intend to get colder, but knew they had no choice. "Still coming down," Walt said unnecessarily. "I can see that," she said. "Sit, eat." She'd made everything she could think of. Biscuits, salt pork, fried potatoes, eggs from the coop, a pot of oatmeal because Danny was a growing boy. She'd put extra coffee on. She'd cut thick slabs of the hard cheese from the pantry and put them on a plate in the center of the table because men going out into a storm like this needed everything she could give them. Caleb looked at the table when he came in. He looked at it for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he'd said that. She nodded and went to fill his coffee. He stood with his men, and they talked in low voices about the cattle and the fences and what order to do things in. And she listened without appearing to and learned more about the ranch in 10 minutes than she'd gathered in 2 weeks. The north pasture cattle were a concern. The fence on the creek side had been weak going into winter, and Caleb was worried about drifts pushing cattle into it. He wanted Pete and Walt to take the fence line first while he and the others moved the animals. "And don't go past the ridge," he said. "Caleb, not in this. I mean it, Pete. Not past the ridge." Pete looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't. They ate fast and went out. The door closed behind them, and the sound of the storm was briefly loud and then muffled again as the house settled back around her. She put Rose in the basket and started on the kitchen and told herself they'd be fine. They were capable men. Caleb was capable. He knew this land. She washed the dishes and told herself this a few more times. By noon, the storm had not eased. If anything, it was worse. She could see maybe 10 feet through the kitchen window. Just the blur of white and the dark suggestion of the fence posts closest to the house. She made dinner and kept it warm, and no one came to eat it. By 2 o'clock, she was checking the window every few minutes. She didn't know these men, not really. She hadn't known Pete Garrett a month ago, or Danny, or any of them. She certainly had no claim on Caleb Mercer, who had told her plainly and clearly that the arrangement was strictly professional and that her child was her responsibility. She went to the window again. White. Nothing but white. She went back to the stove and stirred the pot that didn't need stirring. Rose had been sleeping most of the afternoon, warm and oblivious, tucked in her basket near the fire. She'd eaten well this morning and had her color. She was fine. Rose was fine. Evelyn stirred the pot again. At 3:15, she heard boots on the porch, and then voices. And then the back door burst open and Danny came through it, followed by Tom and Cade, and then Eli. And they were all right. Cold and exhausted, and Cade had ice in his beard, and Tom's hands were shaking badly enough that she took his coat from him because he was having trouble with the buttons. But they were all right. "Where are Pete and Walt?" she asked. "Coming," Danny said, teeth chattering. "Behind us. The cattle are—" He stopped, looked at the pot on the stove, and said nothing else for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "All of you. I'll get the coffee." She got the coffee, and she got them sitting, and she put bowls of stew in front of them, and she asked about Pete and Walt again, and Danny said they'd been right behind them on the trail, and they'd be here. They came in 10 minutes later, Pete first with his arm around Walt, who had twisted his knee on a buried rock and was limping badly enough that he hissed through his teeth when he sat down. "Where's Caleb?" she said. Pete and Walt looked at each other. "He went back for Reed," Pete said. "Reed's horse threw him in the north pasture." Caleb went back. The kitchen went quiet. "How long ago?" she asked. 40 minutes, maybe. Hour. Pete's face was not reassuring. "The visibility up there. I know." "He knows that land," Pete said. It sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "I know," she said again. She poured coffee, and she set out more stew, and she didn't go back to the window because looking at white nothing was not useful, and she was a practical woman, but she listened. She listened to every sound underneath the storm. At 4:30, she heard horses. She was at the door before anyone else moved, and she pulled it open, and through the blowing white she could make out 2 dark shapes coming into the yard, 2 horses and 2 men. Reed slumped forward in the saddle, and Caleb beside him with one hand on Reed's bridle. They came into the circle of light from the window slowly, the horses exhausted, and Caleb's face when she could finally see it was gray-white with cold, his coat thick with ice, his hands on the reins so stiff she could see from the doorway that he was working by determination more than feeling. Reed slid from his horse, and Pete and Danny caught him and got him inside. Caleb dismounted and stood in the yard for a moment, and she could see that he was doing the calculation, "Horses need care before I do." And she said from the doorway, "Pete will see to the horses. Get inside." He looked at her. "Get inside," she said again. "Now." He came. She got him through the door and got his coat off. It was so heavy with ice it was stiff as a board. And she was not gentle about it because gentleness was not what the situation called for. She pushed him to the chair nearest the stove and put his hands around a mug of hot coffee and crouched in front of him and looked at his face. "Can you feel your hands?" she asked. He looked down at them, wrapped around the mug. "Starting to," he said. His voice was rough. "Your feet?" "Yes." "Your face hurts?" He almost smiled at that. A strange, involuntary thing. "Yeah." "That's good. Means the feeling's coming back." She stood up. "Don't move." She got blankets from the cedar chest in the front room. She got the fire hotter. She got her hands on the back of his neck to check the cold there and felt him go very still under the touch. Not from cold, but from something else. And she took her hands away and pulled the blanket around his shoulders instead. The kitchen was crowded and loud around them. Pete and Danny coming back in, Reed sitting at the table with his wrist bound and a color in his face that was better now. The whole crew talking and loud with the relief of being warm and alive and not stuck in a blizzard anymore. In the middle of it, Caleb sat at the stove with his hands around the mug, and she brought him food without asking if he wanted it, and he ate. After a while, the noise settled. The men drifted back to the bunkhouse, Reed helped along by Cade. Walt's knee was wrapped and he was walking on it. Everyone was accounted for. The kitchen emptied. She washed the bowls and the mugs, and she could hear him behind her, still at the stove, not moving. "You should go upstairs," she said. "Get warm properly. Sleep." "In a minute," he said. She dried her hands and turned around. He was looking at the fire through the grate, the mug still in his hands. "Reed's going to be fine," she said. "I know. You both are." "I know that too." He shifted his gaze from the fire to her. His eyes, in the firelight, were more green than gray. "You waited." "Of course I waited." "You didn't have to." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about all the practical things she could say. That she needed to know the men were back to prepare supper. That she had to account for the count. That it was simply management of a household. All of those things were technically true. "No," she said finally. "I did." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the fire. He was quiet for a while. "I lost my parents," he said, "and my sister, 6 years ago. Fever ran through the valley. It took half of 3 families." He paused. "By the time it passed, there was no one left in this house but me." She didn't say anything. She didn't tell him she was sorry, which she was, but which he didn't want, she could tell. She just listened. "I learned to not need things to get warm," he said. "Easier." "I know," she said. And she did know. She'd been learning the same lesson for different reasons. He stood up. He was steadier now, the ice gray gone from his face, color come back to it. He set the mug on the counter. "Good night, Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Good night," she said. He went. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs, counted them by habit. Old habit, from the Denver room, where she'd counted the landlady's footsteps to know when she was coming. The storm outside had not stopped. It was still pressing against the windows, still howling in the gap under the back door. It would be there in the morning. She banked the fire. She turned out the lamp. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment and listened to the storm and thought about what he'd said. "I learned to not need things to get warm," and thought that it was one of the saddest things a person could learn, and that she knew exactly how the learning happened, and that knowing that didn't make it any less sad. She climbed the stairs. In the warm room, Rose was sleeping with both arms thrown out to the sides, open and unguarded, the way babies slept when they didn't know yet that the world required you to protect yourself. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. Then she went in and lay down beside her and closed her eyes and did not let herself think about how far she was from safe. The storm lasted 3 more days. When it finally broke, the ranch lay under 3 feet of snow, and the world outside the windows was so white it was almost painful to look at. And something in the air of the house had changed, quietly, without anyone naming it, the way air changes after lightning, charged and altered and not quite the same as before. The storm broke on a Wednesday, but the cold it left behind was a different animal entirely, drier, sharper, the kind that got into the gaps between your coat buttons and stayed there. The snow had packed itself hard across the yard and piled in drifts against the north side of the barn that came up to a man's shoulder. The world outside the ranch windows was white and flat and still in the way that only happens after a big storm, when the land has been remade overnight and hasn't quite gotten used to itself yet. Evelyn noticed that the men moved differently after the blizzard. Not softer exactly. These were not soft men, and the work hadn't gotten any easier, but with a kind of deliberateness that hadn't been there before. They stamped their boots more carefully at the door. They came in from the cold and sat down at the table and ate without the edge of complaint that had been in the room those first weeks. Walt's knee was healing slowly, and he worked from the barn until it could hold him properly, and nobody said anything about it, which she gathered was a form of respect around here. Reed, for his part, was changed in a way she hadn't expected. He came into the kitchen the morning after the storm, moving carefully on account of the wrist, a bad sprain, not broken, which Pete said was Reed's particular kind of luck. And he sat down at the far end of the table and watched her work for a moment and then said, "I owe you an apology." She put the coffee in front of him. "Do you?" "Pete told me what you did, waiting up, having food ready when we came in." He turned the mug in his good hand. "And I know what I said. Before. About the—" He stopped. "About having a baby on the ranch being a distraction." "I heard you," she said. "Yeah." He looked at the table. "I was wrong about that." She studied him for a moment. He looked younger when he wasn't performing confidence, younger and more uncomfortable, which she supposed was closer to honest. "All right," she said. "That's it? What else do you want me to say, Reed?" He thought about it. "I don't know. I figured you'd be angrier." "I don't have the energy to stay angry at people who admit they were wrong," she said. "It's too rare." He looked up at her. Something crossed his face that might have been relief, or might have been the beginning of something like respect. He drank his coffee and didn't say anything else, and she went back to the biscuits, and that was that. The days shortened further as November settled in. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was already going, and the men came in from the range with frost on their eyebrows and the particular silence of people who have been working outside in cold serious enough to keep conversation to a minimum. The kitchen became the center of the house in a way it hadn't been before. Not just a room where food happened, but a place people came to, the way you went toward light in the dark. She kept the stove burning hot, and there was always coffee, and she didn't make a production of it, but she noticed that the hour before supper, when the men drifted in from the bunkhouse and settled at the table with their hands around mugs and talked about nothing much, was the loosest hour of the day on that ranch. It was during one of these hours that Danny asked about Rose's father. He didn't mean anything by it. He was 17 and he didn't have the social machinery yet to know which questions you didn't ask. He was holding Rose. She'd started letting the men hold her, supervised, and Danny had taken to it with the eagerness of a boy who probably had younger siblings somewhere. And Rose was doing her thing where she grabbed a person's finger and refused to release it, and Danny was watching this with that same expression of surprised delight he always had, and he said, "Where's her pa?" The kitchen went quiet. Not dramatically, just the small quiet of people who suddenly understood they were in the middle of something. "He died," Evelyn said. She kept her voice even. "Before she was born." "Oh." Danny looked up, stricken. "I'm sorry. I didn't think—" "It's all right." "Mining accident?" Pete asked quietly from the corner. He'd been around enough grief to know the shapes it came in. "Yes. A collapse. He was 26. She turned back to the stove. "He never knew about Rose. I found out I was expecting about 2 weeks after." The kitchen was still for a moment. "What was he like?" Danny asked. He wasn't trying to pry, she understood. He just had the instinct of someone young enough to think that talking about the dead was how you honored them. She thought about Hank, about his voice, which was always a little too loud, and the way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, and the mud on his boots that he always knocked off before he came inside. "Loud," she said. "Funny sometimes, though he laughed too early. He was kind, kinder than he looked, which is the best kind." She paused. "He would have been a good father." The stove popped and settled. Rose made a sound and Danny adjusted his grip on her. "She's got your eyes," he said finally. "She's got his jaw," Evelyn said. "Stubborn as anything." That broke the quiet, and Pete laughed, and the conversation moved on the way conversations did, and she was grateful for it. She didn't look toward the doorway, but she was fairly certain, from the way the silence had texture in that direction, that Caleb had been standing there for some portion of it. She didn't know what he'd heard. She didn't ask. But that evening, after supper, he stayed at the table a few minutes longer than he usually did, and when she set the last of the coffee in front of him, he said, "How old was Rose when he died?" She looked at him. "She wasn't born yet. I told you. He died before." "I meant—" He stopped, reset. "How old were you?" 22, she said. "Just—" He nodded once, slowly. "That's young to be on your own." "Younger than I would have liked," she said. He turned the mug. He had a habit with mugs, she'd noticed. He always turned them in his hands when he was working something out, like the rotation helped his thinking. How long were you in Denver? He asked. 4 months. After he died, before I came here. Why Denver? Because that's where the accident was. And because I didn't have anywhere else. And I knew Denver a little. I'd been through it twice. She wiped the counter. It turned out Denver didn't particularly know me back. He almost smiled at that. The corner of his mouth moved. And here? Here was the advertisement, she said simply. He looked at her across the kitchen. The lamp was burning between them, and outside the window, it was fully dark, the cold pressing flat against the glass. You answered a ranch advertisement in Montana with a 6-month-old baby, and 4 months after losing your husband, he said. Not accusatory, just stating it, the way you stated a fact to make sure you had it right. Yes, that's either brave or desperate, he said. Probably both, she said. He nodded again. He finished his coffee and pushed back from the table and stood. And she thought that was the end of it. And then he said, Hank. That was his name? Henry. He went by Hank. Right. He picked up his hat from the hook. Good night, Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her name. She watched him go and stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. And then she turned back to the sink and didn't think about it, which took more effort than it should have. The weeks folded into each other. Evelyn had a way of marking time in her life, not by dates, but by the accumulation of small changes. The way water over stone was not dramatic from one day to the next, but was undeniable over a season. The ranch changed. She changed it, without meaning to, or maybe with the kind of meaning that didn't require announcement. She mended the curtains in the front room, which had been drooping from a broken rod, and replaced the rod with a piece of wood she found in the barn and cut herself with Walt's handsaw. She reorganized the pantry so things were findable without a search, and labeled the jars she'd put up from the dried goods, and found a better system for the root vegetables that kept them from going soft too early. She made soap from the lard and lye she found in the outbuilding. She got the chimney on the kitchen stove cleared and the rattle stopped. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. Pete noticed. Pete noticed everything, which was probably what made him a good foreman. And one afternoon he found her in the pantry doing inventory and said, You're nesting. I'm doing my job, she said. Sure, he said. My wife used to call it nesting. She turned around to look at him. You're married? Was. He said it without particular weight, the way people said things they'd had time to get used to. She died. Few years back. Fever. I'm sorry, Pete. It's all right. He leaned against the doorframe. Point is, I know what it looks like when someone starts making a place theirs. Not because they own it, because they can't help it. He paused. That's not a criticism. I know it's not. Caleb needs this place to feel like something other than just a working operation, he said. He won't admit that, but he does. She looked at the shelves. I'm just the cook. Evelyn. She looked at him. You're very clearly not just the cook, he said, and I think you know it. He pushed off from the doorframe and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she stood in the pantry holding her inventory list and thought that Pete Garrett was a man who saw too much and kept most of it to himself, which was a very specific kind of dangerous. She thought about what he'd said. She thought about it more than she should have, more than was practical, and she put it away in the same place she put all the things she didn't have time to think about, which was getting crowded. The cold deepened. The work did not ease. There was a quality to those November weeks that she would remember later. Not the hardship of it, which was real but not the point, but the texture of ordinary days lived close to other people. The way the kitchen smelled in the morning, coffee and wood smoke and cold air from the back door that never quite sealed. The sound of the crew's voices from the yard, Rose's noises from her basket, the small catalog of observations a baby made about the world, which were not words yet, but were clearly opinions. Danny's laugh, which was too big for him still, like a coat he'd grow into. Walt telling a story in his slow, deliberate way while everyone else was already 3 steps ahead of where he was going and too polite to say so. Old Eli making his small sounds of agreement that meant nothing and everything. And Caleb, at the edges of all of it, present and separate in equal measure. She watched him with his men and saw something different than she'd seen that first evening. With his crew, he was less guarded. Not warm, exactly, but functional in a way that worked. He knew when Danny needed direction and when he needed to be left alone to figure something out. He knew Pete's moods without asking about them. He knew that Eli's hip bothered him in cold weather and scheduled him for lighter work in the mornings without making anything of it. He managed with a quietness that she recognized as a particular kind of intelligence, the kind that paid attention. He just didn't extend it to himself. One afternoon in the second week of November, she was in the barn looking for a particular bucket she needed for the kitchen, and she found Caleb in the back, working on a piece of equipment that had seized up in the cold. He didn't hear her come in. She watched him for a moment, crouched over the thing, working at it with patient, methodical attention, his breath coming in small white clouds. There was a cut on his left hand that he hadn't mentioned, and that she could see from where she stood had not been cleaned properly. "That needs to be cleaned," she said. He startled slightly, just a shift of the shoulders, contained, and looked up at her. "It's fine. It's going to get infected. I've had worse." He went back to the equipment. "I'm sure you have," she said, "but you don't need to right now." She held out her hand. "Come to the kitchen when you're done. I'll clean it." He looked at her hand, then at her face. He had a way of looking at her sometimes that she couldn't entirely categorize, considering, she would have said, if pressed, like she was a problem he was still working out the answer to. "All right," he said. She found her bucket and went back to the house. He came in an hour later, the cut worse than she'd seen from across the barn, a slice along the palm, not deep but long, with dirt worked into it from the equipment. She had him sit at the table and she washed it properly and put carbolic on it, which made him hiss through his teeth, and she wrapped it with clean linen from the medicine box. "How did it happen?" she asked. "Metal edge. Wasn't paying attention." "You're always paying attention." He looked at her. "Not always." She tied off the linen and released his hand. He looked at the bandage. "Thank you," he said. "Don't let it get wet," she said, "and come back tomorrow so I can check it." He nodded. He didn't move to get up right away. Rose was in her basket on the other side of the kitchen, awake and regarding the ceiling beams, and Caleb looked at her, and Rose, who had an instinct for being looked at, turned her head and looked back. They regarded each other for a moment. "She's bigger," Caleb said. "She's 7 months now," Evelyn said. "They change fast." He watched Rose flex her fingers at the ceiling. "She's not afraid of much, is she?" "No, she came out that way. Hank was the same, nothing put him off for long." She picked up her washcloth. "I used to think it was a disadvantage. Now I think it might be the most useful thing she'll ever have." "Not being afraid?" He sounded slightly skeptical. "Not staying afraid," she corrected. "There's a difference." He looked at her. That considering look again. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, something that came out with less insulation than his usual speech, "You don't seem to stay afraid of much, either." She wrung out the cloth. "I seem that way," she said. "Doesn't mean I'm not." He left it there. He got up and thanked her again and went back to the yard, and she stood at the sink and looked out the window at his back as he crossed the snow and thought that she was walking a very fine line and she should be more careful. The problem was that careful had never been something she was particularly good at in the ways that mattered. It was Pete who told her the story. One afternoon when they were alone in the kitchen and the crew was out on the far range and the house was quiet except for Rose and the wind. He'd asked for a second cup of coffee, which was unusual. Pete was a one-cup man as a rule, and he stayed at the table instead of taking it to go, which told her he had something to say. She sat down across from him and waited. "You know he was engaged," Pete said. Not a question. More like he was establishing the starting point of a story. "I didn't know that," she said. "Before the fever. There was a woman, Clara, her name was, from Billings. They were to be married in the spring." He turned his cup. "The fever came in February. Took his mother first, then his father 3 days after, then his sister before the month was out. Clara's family pulled her back to Billings, and that was the end of that." Evelyn was quiet. "She wrote him a letter," Pete said. "After. Explained that she was sorry, but her family needed her close, and Montana in that condition was not. The way she put it was that she couldn't take on that kind of grief." He paused. "Caleb never spoke about it. I only know because I was here, and I could read a situation." "How long ago?" she asked. 6 years. Say 6 years. The ranch had been running for 6 years with one person in it and a rotating crew of seasonal hands and no one permanent except Pete. She looked around the kitchen she'd been slowly remaking. and saw it differently for a moment, saw it the way it must have been. He built something out of it, she said. He did, Pete agreed. But building something isn't the same as being whole. He drank his coffee. I'm not telling you this as... He stopped, seeming to look for the right word. I'm not telling you this as interference. I don't have a stake in how things go between you. But, she said, but he's not going to tell you himself. And I thought you should know what you're dealing with. He set down the cup. Because you're dealing with something, whether you intend to or not. She looked at the table. Pete, she said carefully, I am the cook. I am a widow with a baby and 4 months of Denver behind me and a room upstairs. That's what I am here. He said nothing. That's what I am, she said again, and was aware, uncomfortably, that she sounded like she was trying to convince someone. He picked up his cup and stood. Good coffee today, he said, and went out. She sat at the table for a while after. Rose made a small sound from the basket. The stove ticked in the silence. She was the cook. She was a widow with a baby. She said it again inside her head, and the words arranged themselves correctly and meant what they meant. And the problem was that meaning was one thing and truth was another, and she was increasingly unsure those two things were the same anymore. The cut on Caleb's hand healed cleanly. He came back the next day as she'd asked, and the day after, and by the third day she told him it was fine and he didn't need to come back. And something in his face when she said that, a brief, almost imperceptible thing, gone before she could be sure of it, made her go very still inside. She kept that stillness. She needed it. But she checked the window when he came in from the range, the same as she always did, and she kept his coffee hot. And sometimes in the evenings, when it was just the two of them in the kitchen, she talked to him the way she'd talk to someone she wasn't being careful around, easy and without thought. And he talked back the same way. And they were both pretending very hard that this was simply what it was. The 1st of December arrived on a clear morning with ice crystals in the air and a light so sharp it hurt to look at the snow. Evelyn stood on the back porch in her coat and looked at the mountains and thought that in 3 weeks it would be Christmas. And then she thought about the Christmas before, which had been in Denver in the small room with Rose 6 days old and Hank 8 weeks gone. And she thought that whatever this Christmas was, it was better than that. Rose had found her voice in a new way in the past week. Not words, not yet, but sounds with clear intention behind them. Sounds that meant, pick me up and I am interested in that, and I have had enough of this particular activity. She was sitting up now with support, 7 months of her small self developing opinions about the world and expressing them with increasing enthusiasm. The men thought this was remarkable. Danny in particular treated each new development as if Rose had personally achieved something extraordinary. She looked right at me, he reported one morning, with the solemnity of someone describing a visitation. She looks right at everyone, Danny, Evelyn said. No, but it was different. It was like she was actually seeing me. She's been seeing you for 6 weeks. Not like this. He was utterly certain of this distinction. She let him have it. There were worse things than a 17-year-old boy being convinced a baby had decided he was worth looking at. She watched him settle at the table with Rose balanced on his knee. Carefully, both hands on her, with the attentiveness of someone who understood the weight of being trusted with something small, and thought that Danny was going to be good at whatever life handed him. He had that quality. Some people did. It was the night of the 3rd of December that she saw the light in the barn. She'd gotten up to check on the kitchen fire, which she did sometimes when the cold was particularly deep, and she'd gone to the window to look at the temperature outside by the light meter trick her mother had taught her. The way the air looked under starlight told you things. And she'd seen the yellow rectangle of lantern light in the gap under the barn door. It was past 11. The crew was long in the bunkhouse. There was no reason for anyone to be in the barn. She stood at the window for a moment. The lantern light was steady. Whatever was happening in there, it wasn't urgent. She went back to bed, but she thought about it, lying in the dark with Rose's small, warm weight beside her, and she filed it away without meaning to. She would find out what it meant later. For now there was the dark and the cold, and the ranch lying still under its covering of snow, and the light in the barn burned on through the night. And December had arrived, and everything was still moving towards something she couldn't quite see the shape of yet. She didn't ask him about the barn light the next morning, or the morning after that. She filed it the way she filed a lot of things about Caleb Mercer. Sideways. In the part of her mind she kept organized separately from the part that ran the kitchen and managed the meals and made practical decisions about lard quantities and chimney cleaning. It sat there, and she left it alone and told herself it was none of her business. But she noticed over the following days that he was going out there at night. Not every night, but enough. She'd see the light when she got up to check the fire, that same yellow rectangle in the gap under the barn door, steady and quiet. Whoever was in there, and she knew who it was, wasn't doing anything urgent. It was deliberate work, patient work. She thought about Pete's voice saying he's not going to tell you himself, and she thought about Caleb turning his coffee mug in his hands, and she thought about 6 years of running a house alone, and she kept all of it in the organized compartment and closed the lid. December moved the way December always did, faster than you expected and more relentless. The cold had settled in properly now, the kind that didn't ease during the day, that made the horses' breath come out in long plumes when they were brought from the barn and made the ground ring like iron underfoot. The days were short and gray, and the light, when it came, was thin and pale and lasted about as long as your patience with it. The work rhythm shifted with the season. The long cattle drives were done until spring, and the crew's days were shorter in some ways and longer in others. Fence maintenance, equipment repair, feed management, the particular tedium of winter ranch work that wasn't dramatic but had to happen, or everything else fell apart. The men were around more, which meant the kitchen was busier through the day, which she didn't mind. Noise was something she'd grown to appreciate. The Denver room had been too quiet. It was during this quieter stretch of work that she started to understand the financial situation. She hadn't been looking for it. She was in the front room cleaning the windows. They'd gone gray with chimney smoke, and she'd decided one afternoon that this bothered her. And the ledger was open on the table, which it sometimes was when Caleb had been working on accounts. She wasn't reading it, but numbers in a certain configuration had a way of speaking even sideways, and she caught enough to understand that the summer had been harder than it looked. 2 bad months on cattle prices. The cost of a piece of equipment that had broken at the wrong time. A loan with a Billings bank that had terms she didn't fully see but whose presence was clear. She closed the ledger. She went back to the windows. But she thought about it. She thought about Caleb at the table some evenings after supper with the ledger open, his face doing nothing in particular, which was the face people used when what they were looking at required more than they wanted to show. She thought about the wages she'd been drawing. Modest, they'd agreed. Room and board, mostly. Not enough to be a burden, she hoped. Not enough to make a difference to whatever those numbers said. She went back to the kitchen and started on supper and kept her own counsel. What she did quietly was begin to look for places she could save money without anyone having to know that was what she was doing. The soap she'd started making instead of buying. The bread she baked twice weekly from scratch that cut the need for store-bought goods to near nothing. The way she stretched the venison further with root vegetables and dried beans, making a pound of meat do the work of 2 without anyone at the table noticing a reduction. She wasn't performing sacrifice. She was just doing math, which was something she'd gotten very practiced at in Denver. Caleb noticed because he noticed things. He came to her one evening in early December, a Tuesday, she was fairly sure, though the days had started to blur a little around their edges, and he sat at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "The supply order from Harlan Creek. You cut it by 1/3. She set down the pot she was holding. "The pantry is well stocked. We don't need everything I originally listed." "That's not why you cut it." She looked at him. He was watching her with that particular steadiness. "The ledger was open on the table," she said. "I didn't read it. I just saw enough." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not your concern," he said, but he said it without force. More like he was saying what was expected than what he meant. "I know that," she said. "I'm just managing supplies the way I would anyway." She turned back to the stove. "If you want me to restore the order, I can." "I don't," he said, after a pause. I don't want you to think the situation is—" "I don't think anything about it," she said. "It's a hard year. There have been harder." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "You'll make it." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Say things like that?" He turned his mug. "Like you just know." "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just think it's more useful than the alternative." He sat with that for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, wind moved along the eaves. My father ran this place for 30 years, he said. He had bad years too, worse than this, some of them. He wasn't looking at her anymore, looking at the table. He used to say that land didn't care what you owed on it. That was the bank's problem. The land just needed tending. Smart man, Evelyn said. He was. The word settled. Was. He would have liked you, I think. She didn't say anything to that. She didn't know what to say, and she'd learned that silence was sometimes kinder than words that weren't good enough. After a moment, he got up and went out, and she stood at the stove, and the kitchen held the shape of what had just happened for a while before the ordinary business of evening claimed it back. The blizzard came on a Saturday. Not the modest snowstorm of October, by suppose, that now seemed like a rehearsal. This was something that came down from the Canadian border with genuine intent. The kind of storm that old-timers described with a specific kind of respect, usually reserved for things that had tried to kill them. It announced itself Friday evening with a sky that turned a particular greenish-yellow color that Walt looked at and said simply, "Tomorrow's going to be bad." And he was right in the way that people who'd been watching weather in one place for 20 years tended to be right. Evelyn spent Friday night preparing. She brought in as much wood as the back porch could hold. She made sure the water barrel in the kitchen was full. She checked the pantry and calculated meals for 4 days in case access to the outbuildings became difficult. She wrapped the gap under the back door with a piece of old canvas she found in the barn, which cut the draft substantially and which she probably should have done in October. She did all of this quietly, without announcement, and went to bed at 10. She was up at 4. The storm had already arrived. She could hear it before she opened her eyes. Not wind exactly, but the sound of something massive moving against the house. A low continuous pressure that wasn't like the October blizzard's sharp fury, but was more constant, more settled, like something that intended to stay. When she went to the window, she couldn't see the barn. She couldn't see the fence. She could see the near edge of the porch railing, and then nothing. She built the fire and started breakfast. Caleb came down at 4:30. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the window and then at her. "You knew this was coming," he said. "Walt knew," she said. "I just paid attention." He went to the window and looked out at the wall of white. The set of his shoulders told her what he was calculating. The cattle, the same worry as always, where they were, and what the drifts were doing to the fence lines. "The north pasture herd is in the lower field," he said, more to himself than her. "If the fence on the creek side lets go, how far is it?" 4 miles, maybe 4.5 in normal conditions. He turned from the window. "And this could be twice that. The drifts will close the trail." "Then you'll go when you can and not before," she said. She put the coffee on the table. "Sit down." He sat down. He drank the coffee. The crew came in at 5, and the kitchen filled with the particular energy of men who knew a hard day was ahead of them and were getting their minds around it. Pete assessed the window with his foreman's practicality, not frightened exactly, but making calculations she could almost see him doing. Danny was quiet, which was unusual. Even at 17, he understood what a storm like this could mean. Walt moved slowly on his healing knee, but he moved, which said everything about his intentions. Reed, she noticed, had changed in the weeks since the first blizzard. He was still handsome, and he still knew it, but he'd lost some of the careless edge he'd carried when she arrived. He sat at the table that morning, and he ate, and he looked at the window with the same sober attention the rest of them did. And when Caleb laid out the plan for the day, Reed listened without the posturing she'd seen in those first weeks. Caleb's plan was careful. He wasn't being reckless. She could see that. He wanted Pete and Walt to take the barn and outbuildings and make sure everything was secured and the animals inside were properly fed and watered. He wanted Tom and Cade on the near fence line, working close to the house, not going further than they could see. He and Reed and Danny would take the trail toward the north pasture, assess the fence, try to get to the cattle. "You said 4 miles, she said. He looked at her. "You said 4 miles in normal conditions. This is not normal conditions." "I know what I said." "And you're taking Danny." There was a silence. Danny straightened slightly, which was the posture of someone who wanted to be taken seriously and wasn't sure whether to be grateful or offended. "Danny's a good hand," Caleb said. "He knows the trail." "I know he does," she said. "I'm not questioning that." She looked at him steadily. "I'm just saying 4 miles in a whiteout with 3 people instead of 5 is a different calculation than you're making it sound." The table was very quiet. Caleb held her gaze. She could see him working through it. Not the annoyance, which was there, but the underneath of the annoyance, which was that she wasn't wrong. "We'll rope together," he said. "Standard practice in a blow like this. We won't lose the trail." "All right," she said. "We know what we're doing, Evelyn." "I know you do." She turned back to the stove. "Eat your breakfast." Pete across the table was studying the bottom of his coffee cup with great concentration. They went out at 5:30, roped together, three dark shapes that disappeared into the white within 30 feet of the porch. She watched them go from the window. She stayed at the window until she couldn't see them anymore, which took no time at all, and then she turned back to the kitchen. Pete and Walt went to the barn. Tom and Cade took the near fence line and were back within 2 hours, which was the right call. The visibility made work past the first fence post a matter of feel more than sight. They came in stamping snow from their boots, and she had coffee ready, and she didn't ask about Caleb because asking wouldn't help, and they didn't know any more than she did. The morning passed. She fed the fire. She checked the wood supply on the porch, which was holding. She made bread because bread was something she could do, and she shaped the loaves and put them in the oven and watched the kitchen fill with the smell of it, which was one of the smells that made a house feel less like it was under siege. Rose was fussier than usual. She picked up on things, still. The tension in the house, the quality of the light, the fact that her mother was checking the window more than she needed to. Evelyn held her and moved around the kitchen with her on her hip, talking to her in the low, continuous murmur she'd developed for exactly these situations, narrating whatever she was doing. "This is bread. This is what it smells like when it's done. Your grandmother taught me this. She had a lighter hand than I do. Yours will probably be lighter too. You've got your father's hands." She had no idea if any of it registered, but it kept her own voice steady, which was its purpose. Noon came. She made dinner and kept it warm. Pete came in at 12:30 and poured himself coffee and looked at the window with professional inscrutability. "Still can't see past the barn," he said. "I know. Caleb's been in worse." "I know that too." He drank his coffee. He didn't leave, which was its own information. Pete stayed close when there was something to stay close for. At 2 o'clock, the visibility dropped further, which had not seemed possible, and turned out to be. The wind picked up to a pitch she hadn't heard yet, a sound that wasn't quite right, that had too much force behind it for the house to absorb quietly. The windows shuddered. Something in the upper story made a sound she didn't like. At 2:30, she heard Walt's voice from the barn. She couldn't make out words, just the pitch of urgency. And then footsteps, fast, on the porch. Pete was up before she could say anything. The door burst open, and it was Danny, ice on his eyelashes and his face white in a way that wasn't from cold. And behind him Reed, and Reed had his arm around someone, and she was moving before she fully processed what she was seeing. Caleb was on his feet, but barely. He had ice in his beard, and his coat was solid with it, stiff as board, and his face had the flat color of someone who'd been too cold for too long. Reed had him by the arm and was saying something to Pete that she didn't catch because she was already at Caleb's other side, getting under his arm, guiding him toward the stove. "Get this off him," she said, and Pete went for the coat. It took both of them to get it free. The linen underneath was damp with cold sweat, and she got her hands on his face, both palms against his jaw. And he flinched slightly at the contact, whether from cold or surprise she didn't know, and she said, "Look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were tracking. That was good. "Your name," she said. "I know my own name," he said. His voice was rough and slow. "Indulge me." "Caleb Mercer." A beat. "This is my kitchen." "It is," she said. "Sit down." She got him into the chair nearest the stove, and she got the blanket from the front room, and she put his hands around a mug of coffee that was hot enough to hurt, and crouched in front of him the way she'd done after the October blizzard, checking his hands and his color and the quality of his attention. "Feet?" she said. "Yes." "Painful?" "Getting there." "Face?" He looked at her for a moment. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "Same as before." "Good." She stood up. Same answer. Behind her, Danny was talking, explaining in the breathless rush of someone offloading something that had been pressing on him. A problem with the fence, as Caleb had feared, a section down into the creek bed, cattle pushed against the remaining posts. They'd gotten the cattle back and repaired what they could, but the visibility dropped and they'd nearly lost the trail coming back, and Caleb had. Took the outside position on the rope, and when the gust hit, and then something about a drift that had given way underfoot. Reed, who had said almost nothing since coming in, sat at the table and drank the coffee she'd put in front of him and said quietly, "He kept the rope from us, pulled me back when I went over." He wasn't looking at anyone when he said it, just at the table. Could have let go. The kitchen was very still for a moment. "All right," Pete said, his foreman's voice steady. "Everyone's in. Everyone's whole." He looked at Reed. "You can think about it later." Reed nodded. He drank his coffee. The storm howled against the house. Inside, the fire burned hard and the bread was warm in the oven, and the men arranged themselves around the kitchen in the slow way of people who were not going anywhere and knew it. Evelyn moved between the stove and the table. She filled mugs. She cut bread and put it on the table with butter from the cold cabinet. She did these things automatically, her hands knowing the work without requiring instruction from her brain, which was occupied with checking Caleb every few minutes. His color, his breathing, the steadiness coming back into his hands as the heat reached him. He was watching her. She knew it the way you knew when someone was watching, a particular quality of attention directed at you from across a room. She didn't look back. She poured the next cup and carried it to Danny and told him to drink it all. It was an hour later when the crew had drifted back to the bunkhouse in twos. First Tom and Cade, then Danny, then Eli, who'd been in the barn and came in for warmth and left again when the barn needed him, then Reed, who stopped at the door and said something quiet that she didn't catch but which Caleb answered with a short nod. That the kitchen cleared out to just the two of them. Pete was last. He looked between them with that seen too much quality of his, and he said, "Fire in the bunkhouse is stoked," to Caleb, and Caleb said, "Good." And Pete went out, and the kitchen door closed, and the storm was very loud outside. She was washing bowls. He was still at the table, the blanket around his shoulders, the color back in his face now. The real color. Not the heat flush of returning warmth, but the ordinary color of him, the one she'd learned without meaning to. "The fence?" she said. "Held the cattle, long enough to get them to the upper shelter." He paused. "It'll need proper repair when the weather breaks." "But they're all right." "They're all right." He turned his mug. "Reed did good work out there." "Danny said you kept the rope." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what the rope is for." "You could have let go." "No," he said. "I couldn't have." She put the last bowl on the rack and dried her hands. She stood at the counter and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the fire made its sounds, and the storm made its sounds, and everything else was quiet. "You scared me," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out plainly, without decoration, which was maybe why she hadn't planned it. He didn't look away. "I know. I was watching the window for 6 hours." "I know," he said again, softer. "Don't do that again," she said. "Don't!" She stopped. She could hear how it sounded. She could hear exactly how it sounded, and she couldn't take it back. He was very still. "Evelyn," he said. "Forget it," she said. "I'm tired. I'm saying things that don't do that," he said. She looked at him. "Don't make it smaller than it is," he said. "I've been doing that since October, and it doesn't get any easier." The fire popped. Outside, the storm leaned against the house. She should have said something practical. She should have turned back to the counter, or gone to check on Rose, or any number of things that would have put ordinary distance between this moment and the next one. She knew this. She was 23 years old, and she had been through enough to know exactly what happened when you stopped being careful. What she said was, "How long have you been going out to the barn at night?" He blinked. It was not what he'd expected. "You've seen the light. Some nights." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Something worked itself out in his face. Not calculation, but decision, which was different. "Come and see," he said. "Not tonight, when the storm breaks." He looked at his hands around the mug. "I wanted to be done before I showed you, but I'm not done." "What is it?" she said. "Something I started building," he said. "About a week after you got here." She held very still. "A week after I arrived." "Yes." She didn't ask what it was. She thought she might already know, or something close to it, and knowing for certain felt like stepping toward a line she hadn't decided yet whether to cross. "All right," she said. When the storm breaks. He nodded. He stood up, carefully. She could see the stiffness in him, the day's violence still living in his muscles, and he set the mug on the counter and stopped beside her for just a moment, close enough that she could see the line of his jaw and the state of his coat and the particular exhaustion that wasn't physical. "Thank you," he said, for the third time in all the weeks since October. But this time it meant something wider than she could quite get her hands around. "Go to bed," she said. "You need to sleep." He went. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, slower than usual, heavier, and then the quiet of the upper story settling around him. She went to check on Rose, who had fallen asleep in her basket sometime during the worst of the afternoon, and had stayed asleep through all of it, through the noise and the fear and the returning men and the smell of wet wool and cold coffee. She was sleeping still, both arms out, her face the perfect blank of infant unconsciousness. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter and thought about a man who had started building something a week after she arrived, who went out to the barn at night by lantern light to work on it, who had not mentioned it in 6 weeks. She thought about what it meant to make something for someone without telling them you were making it. The intention required for that, the kind of intention that didn't need to announce itself because it was already certain. She was 23, and she'd been surviving on practicality for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like when something was not about survival at all. She went back to the kitchen and banked the fire and stood at the window for a moment. The storm was still there, still pressing, still making its insistent case against the glass. It would break eventually. Everything did. She went upstairs, she lay down beside Rose. She did not sleep for a long time. The storm broke on a Monday, which felt arbitrary, the way weather always did, indifferent to the shape it had imposed on the days inside it. The morning after, Evelyn woke to a silence so complete it had its own texture, and she lay still for a moment before she understood that the absence of wind was what had woken her. After 3 days of constant pressure against the house, the quiet felt almost wrong. Outside the window, the world was remade again. The drifts had sculpted the yard into something unfamiliar. The fence posts wore caps of snow 3 feet high. The woodpile had become a smooth white shape that bore no resemblance to stacked wood, and the barn had a ridge along its roof edge that caught the early light and turned it briefly gold before the sun got higher and ordinary. She built the fire. She started coffee. She thought about the barn. Caleb came down at his usual time, and he poured his coffee and stood at the window looking at the yard with the particular assessment of a man calculating what the storm had cost him. The cattle were the first priority. She knew that without being told, knew the whole ordering of his concerns by now, the way you learned the rhythms of a house you lived in long enough. "Go see to what needs seeing," she said. "There'll be food when you come back." He looked at her. "The barn isn't going anywhere," she said. Something moved in his face. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or just the recognition that she understood the ordering of things. He nodded and went out, and she turned back to the stove. The crew spent the morning on recovery work, digging out the pathways, checking the fence lines, getting to the cattle, and assessing the damage the storm had done to the already weakened creek fence. Tom and Cade came in at 10 with the report that 3 posts had gone entirely, and a section of rail was buried under a drift that would need a day's work to clear. Caleb's response, when Pete relayed this, was a single, slow nod. Worse things had happened. It was fixable. By afternoon, the yard was passable, and the horses were out, and the particular productive noise of a working ranch had returned to replace the storm's siege. Evelyn made a large midday meal and watched the kitchen fill and empty and fill again, and she noticed that the men moved with the specific energy of people who had been cooped up and were glad of cold air and physical work. Even Walt, whose knee was still not entirely right, was moving more freely, as if motion itself was the medicine. Rose had been awake most of the morning, watching the window with wide eyes, as if she too was assessing the changed world outside. She was 8 months old now, solidly herself in ways that continued to surprise Evelyn. The specificity of her opinions, the particular sounds she made for particular situations, the way she tracked certain people with her eyes. She tracked Caleb. Evelyn had noticed this for a while but hadn't named it, the way she didn't name certain other things. But it was true. When Caleb came into a room, Rose's attention shifted to him with a consistency that was not random. She did it with Pete too, and with Danny, but differently. With Caleb there was something more deliberate about it. like she was waiting to see what he would do. What he did, generally, was look back at her briefly and then look away. But the briefly had been getting longer. It was close to 4 in the afternoon when he came to the kitchen door and stood in the frame still wearing his coat. "If you still want to see it," he said. She was at the counter rolling dough. She stopped. "Yes." "Rose can—" He paused, which was not something he did often. "She can come, if you want." She looked at him. He was not entirely comfortable with the offer, she could see that. He'd made it because it was the right thing, and not because it was easy, which she was coming to understand was how he did most things. "Let me get her coat," she said. The barn was cold but out of the wind, which made it bearable. It smelled of hay and horses, and the particular dry animal warmth that was not unpleasant. The horses shifted in their stalls at her entrance, familiar with her by now. She'd been bringing them windfall apples from the bin in the pantry for weeks, a fact she had not advertised. Caleb led her to the back of the barn, past the stalls and the equipment and the hay bales stacked against the far wall. In the corner, under a canvas that he lifted and set aside, was a cradle. It was not a simple thing. She'd expected simple, a box with rockers, functional, the kind of thing built quickly for a practical purpose. This was not that. The pine was pale and smooth, sanded to a finish that caught the lantern light. The sides were shaped with a gentle curve at the head and foot, and along the outer rail of the headboard, carved in shallow relief, was a single 5-pointed star. Not decorative exactly, more like a mark, deliberate and specific. The rockers were solid and well-joined, curved in a proportion that she could tell without touching it would move with the right weight, not too fast. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Rose, on her hip, looked at it too. Then she made a sound. One of her clear, specific sounds. Not quite a word, but not one either, and reached one small hand toward it. "She can touch it," Caleb said. He sounded stiff, like someone who had made a thing and was now terrified of what would be said about it. Evelyn stepped close enough that Rose's outstretched hand could reach the railing. Her small fingers ran along the smooth wood, patted it twice, and then curled back. Rose appeared satisfied with this information. "The star," Evelyn said. "I know it's—" He stopped, started again. "I couldn't leave it plain. It seemed wrong." "No, it's right." She traced the edge of the carving with her finger. The lines were not perfectly even. She could see up close where the chisel had slipped slightly on one point, where the wood grain had made one edge rougher than intended. It was handmade in the truest sense. It had his hands in it. "How long did this take you?" 3 weeks, most nights." He was looking at the cradle, not at her. "I'm not a cabinet maker. It took longer than it should have." "It's better than a cabinet maker would have done," she said. He looked at her then. "A cabinet maker makes things to sell," she said. "This is different." He was quiet. The horse in the nearest stall shifted and blew out a slow breath, and the lantern flame moved slightly in a draft she couldn't feel, and Rose put her head down on Evelyn's shoulder in the way she did when she was thinking about sleeping. "I didn't know what to do when you arrived," he said. I didn't expect a child. I meant what I said about it, that first night. I'd made an arrangement, and it wasn't what I'd agreed to." "I know. But I was also wrong," he said, "about what it would mean." He looked at the cradle. "I started this because I felt like I owed her something for how I handled it. That first night." Evelyn looked at the side of his face. "You let us stay, after I told you to leave, and then a snowstorm made me reasonable." He said it flatly, without excusing himself. "That's not the same as handling it right." She thought about what to say to that. She thought about the first evening, his face going cold when he saw Rose, the order to leave, the feeling of standing at the edge of everything with nowhere to go. She hadn't forgiven him for it because it hadn't required forgiveness. She'd understood it even then, and understanding something took a different kind of energy than holding a grievance about it. "It was a shock," she said. "You reacted like a person who'd been surprised. Worse people have reacted worse to less. That's a low standard." "Maybe," she said, "but you've been meeting a higher one every day since." She looked at the cradle. "This is a high one." He didn't answer that. She wasn't sure he knew how to take a thing said directly and let it sit without deflecting it, which was all right. She wasn't sure she needed him to. They walked back to the house in the cold, late afternoon light, and she carried Rose, who was very nearly asleep, and Caleb walked beside her without saying anything, and the snow crunched under their feet in the specific way of frozen surface snow, hollow-sounding and clean. That evening, after supper, he carried the cradle from the barn and up the stairs to the warm room. She heard the footsteps on the stairs and the pause at the top, and then the sound of it being set down, careful, not rushed, and she finished the dishes before she went up. He was standing in the doorway of the room looking at the cradle in the corner. She stood beside him in the doorway. "It'll do," he said. Testing something in his own voice, she thought, seeing how understatement wore. "It'll do," she agreed. "More than." Rose went into the cradle that night for the first time and slept in it, and the drawer that had served for 8 months was retired with a dignity that no drawer had ever previously required. The 2 weeks that followed had a different quality than anything before them. Not easier. The work didn't ease, and the cold didn't ease, and there was still the creek fence to rebuild and the quarterly supply run to calculate, and all the ordinary machinery of a winter ranch running through its season. But something in the air of the house had shifted, and everyone who lived and worked in it felt the shift without needing to name it. The men were starting to talk about spring, not constantly. Ranchers were superstitious about counting weather they hadn't lived through yet, but it crept into the conversation in small ways, plans and intentions, and the particular restless energy of people who had been indoor-bound and were starting to want horizon again. Tom and Cade were talking about the spring cattle run with the specificity of men who had opinions about it. Danny was talking about something vague and ambitious to do with horses that Pete listened to with patient skepticism. Reed had mentioned twice, with deliberate casualness, that he was thinking about coming back next year if the position was open, which was Reed's way of asking a question he was too proud to ask directly. She heard Caleb's answer, "Position's open," short and without ceremony, and she saw Reed's jaw relax, and that was that. She and Caleb had fallen into something that didn't have a name she was comfortable applying to it. Evenings in the kitchen after the crew had gone, not always, not every night, but often enough that the absence of it on the nights it didn't happen was noticeable. He talked about the ranch, and she talked about what needed doing in the house, and somewhere between those two topics they talked about other things, the kind of other things that accumulated slowly between people who were paying attention to each other, whether they meant to or not. He told her about his father, who had been a quiet man with a loud laugh, which he said was a confusing combination. She told him about her mother, who had been the opposite, loud presence, quiet grief, never letting one interfere with the other. He told her about the summer he was 12 when half the creek dried up, and his father had moved the cattle on foot, all of them, over 3 days, to the neighboring valley. She told him about learning to make bread in a kitchen so small she and her mother stood back to back while they worked. They were building something, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, because saying so would require deciding what it was. The moment came on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks before Christmas. She was mending one of his work coats. The left sleeve had come apart at the seam, which she'd noticed 3 days ago and taken without asking. And he was at the table with the accounts ledger, though he wasn't writing. He was watching her. She knew he was watching. She kept her eyes on the seam. "Pete told you about Clara," he said. She kept her hand moving with the needle. "Yes." "I thought he might have." He was quiet for a moment. "He tell you everything?" "I think so." "Then you know why I—" He stopped. "Why it's been the way it's been. With people." "I know," she said. "It's not that I thought you were her," he said carefully. "I didn't think that. You're not like her in any way that I can see. What I thought was that I was done with the kind of wanting that made losing her mean as much as it did." He turned the pencil in his hands. "I thought I'd gotten sensible about it." She tied off the thread. She looked up at him. "And?" she said. He met her eyes. He looked the way he had in the barn that first evening, like a man who'd stepped on a nail and knew it and was deciding what to do about it. Except this time the expression had something different underneath it. Not cold, nothing like cold. "And I was wrong," he said, "about being done." The fire made its sounds. Outside the kitchen window the December dark was absolute, and the ranch was quiet, and somewhere upstairs Rose was sleeping in her pine cradle with the hand-carved star. She set the coat on the table. She thought about Hank, not the way she thought about him when the grief was sharp, but the other way, the softer way. She thought about the mud on his boots and the way he knocked it off before he came through the door because she'd asked him once and he never forgot. She thought about him in the way you thought about someone you had loved and lost and carried forward with you as something that didn't diminish you. She thought about $4.60 in her coat pocket on a frozen October evening. She thought about a door opening and a man who had gone cold at the sight of her child. She thought about all the ways things could have gone differently and hadn't. "I know about wanting things you decided not to want anymore," she said. "I spent 4 months in Denver deciding Rose was enough, that she was all I needed and all I was going to need." He was very still. "I still think that's true," she said. "She's enough. She's more than enough." She looked at him. "But enough doesn't mean all. I learned that somewhere between October and now." He looked at her for a long moment. The pencil had stopped moving. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I've been on my own for a long time. I've got habits that are going to be difficult." A pause. "I know I'm not easy." "I know you're not," she said. "I've been watching you for 2 months." "And you're not easy either," he said. "I want to say that too because it's true. You came in here under false pretenses and rearranged everything I had set up, and you don't apologize for taking up space." She almost smiled. "No, I don't." "I don't want you to," he said. It came out plain and unguarded, the kind of plain that wasn't practiced. "I want to be clear about that." She looked at him across the table, this man who had gone into a blizzard for his crew and built a cradle by lantern light and couldn't take a compliment without redirecting it, but could say I was wrong who turned coffee mugs in his hands when he was working things out, and whose ranch ran well because he paid attention to everything except himself. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're working up to," she said. "Ask me." He set the pencil down. He put his hands flat on the table, both of them, open, which was the opposite of guarded, and he said, "Stay. Not as the cook, not as the arrangement. Stay because I want you here, you and Rose both." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stay." The kitchen was quiet around them, the stove ticking, the fire steady. She thought about the advertisement in the back of a newspaper. She thought about 1,200 miles of travel with a baby on her hip and $4.60. She thought about all the things she'd survived to get to this particular Thursday evening, in this particular kitchen in Montana, with snow on the ground and a man looking at her with his hands open on the table. She reached across and put one hand over his. "I'm already here," she said. He looked at her hand on his for a moment. Then he turned his hand over so his palm was up and her hand was in it, and he closed his fingers. They stayed like that for a while, in the quiet kitchen, without needing to make it more than what it was. It was enough. More than enough. The hand-holding didn't change everything overnight. That was the honest truth of it, and Evelyn appreciated honesty more than she appreciated comfort, so she held on to it. The next morning, Caleb was up before her, which had never happened, and when she came down to the kitchen, the fire was already going, and there was water heating on the stove, and he was standing at the window with his coffee looking out at the yard. And he turned when she came in and said, "Morning," in exactly the same voice he'd used every other morning for 2 months. And she said, "Morning," back, and that was that. It wasn't romantic, which was fine. Neither of them were particularly romantic people. What they were was practical, and practical people understood that a thing said on a Thursday night had to be lived into on Friday morning, and the living was a different kind of work than the saying. But there were small things. She noticed them the way she noticed most things, sideways without making production of them. The way he started bringing in the morning wood before she asked, which she'd been doing herself since October. The way he lingered at the table after breakfast sometimes. Not long, just a few minutes past where he'd have gotten up before, and it wasn't about the coffee. The way he looked at her when she was talking to the crew, a specific kind of attention that was different from how he'd looked at her before. Less measuring and more something else she didn't have a clean word for. She noticed. She let him be who he was and didn't require him to be more than that, because that was what she'd want in return. Pete noticed too, of course. Pete would have noticed a change in barometric pressure inside a conversation. He said nothing about it, which was his particular form of respect, and she appreciated that too. The creek fence got rebuilt in the week before Christmas, Tom and Kate and Reed working at it with the concentrated effort of men who wanted it done and done right. The days had a momentum to them now. The end of the cattle season meant a shift in focus, and Caleb had the men working on equipment and outbuildings, preparation for spring, the patient infrastructure work that a ranch needed in winter to function well come March. She heard him talking to Pete about the spring breeding schedule, about which pastures needed rotating, about a section of the North Range he wanted to fence properly before the grass came back. He was planning forward, which she understood was not something he'd been doing much of. Real planning, the kind that imagined the future clearly enough to prepare for it specifically. She was part of that future now, without anyone having said so explicitly. She felt it in the way he talked about the spring kitchen garden he thought they should put in along the south fence. We could put in, he'd said, not I've been meaning to, and in the way he'd mentioned once, carefully, that the room off the back of the house could be opened up properly if someone wanted to, made into more than a storage space, which it currently was. She had let both of these things sit without commenting on them directly, but she was not confused about what they meant. The week before Christmas, the men started departing. It happened every year, Pete explained. The hands who had families elsewhere went to them for the season, returning in late January when the winter work picked back up. It was a regular rhythm of the place, a temporary contraction. Tom and Cade left together on a Monday, headed south to their mothers in Wyoming. Danny left Tuesday, heading home to his family in Billings with such poorly concealed excitement that even Walt smiled about it. Eli took the Wednesday supply wagon into Harlan Creek and didn't come back, which Pete said was also regular. Eli spent Christmas with his sister's family in town. Reed left on Thursday. He came to the kitchen before he went, which she hadn't expected. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was new for Reed, who was usually in possession of more casual confidence than the situation required. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "When you first came." "What I said." He turned the hat. "I said the baby was a distraction. I told you I apologized for that back in November, and I meant it. But I want to say something more specific now." He looked at her. "You changed things here. I don't know if you know that, or if you'll stay long enough to—" He stopped, seemed to decide that direction was above his pay grade. "I'm just saying I noticed, and I was wrong about all of it." She looked at him. He was about 24, she thought, and trying hard, and the trying had cost him something in pride, which was the currency Reed usually hoarded. "You did good work in that blizzard," she said. "Caleb told me." Something in his face shifted. "He said that?" "He said you were a good hand in a bad situation." Reed nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. "Merry Christmas, Evelyn." "Safe travels, Reed." He went. She watched him ride out from the kitchen window, and she thought that of all the changes she'd seen on this ranch in 2 months, Reed might be the one she'd have least predicted. By the weekend before Christmas, the ranch had reduced to 4. Caleb, Pete, Walt, whose knee had decided to have an opinion about winter travel, which made the decision to stay simple, and Evelyn, with Rose. The big table in the kitchen sat mostly empty, which would have felt like absence 2 months ago and now felt like a different thing, like space for something quieter. Walt turned out to be an unexpectedly companionable presence in small numbers. He'd been steady and background in a full crew, but with the crowd gone, he expanded slightly, told longer versions of his slow stories, seemed more comfortable in the kitchen, developed a specific fondness for Rose that expressed itself in long, detailed conversations with her about the horses, conducted in a voice he apparently reserved for infants and livestock. "She understands more than people think," he told Evelyn one morning, entirely serious. "She does," Evelyn agreed, entirely serious in return, because she believed it. Pete was Pete, contained and seeing everything, a constant in the way that useful things were constants. He split the extra wood without being asked and fixed the loose step on the back porch that had been loose since October, and said nothing about either, which was exactly right. 3 days before Christmas, it snowed again. Not a blizzard, a clean, honest snowfall that came down straight and thick and covered everything and stopped, leaving the world new-looking and calm. Evelyn stood on the back porch in the morning and looked at it, at the way the barn wore its fresh white, and the fence posts stood in their straight row, and the mountains beyond the range sat enormous and still and white against a sky that was clearing to blue. She thought, "I came here with nothing, and I am standing here with something, and I don't know exactly what to call it, but it is real, and it is mine." She was 23 years old. She had a daughter sleeping in a pine cradle with a hand-carved star. She had a kitchen she knew by feel. She had a life that was beginning to look like a life, and not like the long emergencies she'd been managing since Hank died. It was not perfect. She needed to be honest with herself about that, because the temptation when things improved was to stop seeing them clearly. The financial situation was still tight and would be through spring. Caleb was still guarded in ways that would take a long time to ease, if they eased fully, which she was not certain they would. She still had mornings where she woke and the first thing she felt was the specific weight of Hank's absence, clean and heavy as riverstone. Rose was going to keep growing and changing and requiring things of her that she couldn't predict. Nothing about any of this was resolved in the clean way stories sometimes resolved things. But she was standing on the porch in the morning snow, and she was not afraid of what came next, and that counted for something. That counted for a lot. Caleb found her there. He came out with her coat, she'd forgotten it, and put it around her shoulders without comment, then stood beside her looking at the same view she'd been looking at. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Your father knew what he was doing, choosing it. He said the same thing about it, almost exactly. He looked at the mountains. He said you could tell what land thought of itself by how it sat in the morning light. That land with good character didn't flinch when the sun hit it." She looked at the mountains. He was right. He was right about most things. He paused. He would have argued with me about the years I ran this place alone. He thought people needed people around them. He used to say a ranch without a family in it was just a business. She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the mountains. "He was right about that too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have something to ask you." He said it with the careful weight of someone who had been rehearsing it, which she understood because that was how he did things. He thought about them first, completely, before he said them out loud. "I know I already asked you to stay, and you said yes. But I want to ask you something more specific than that." She waited. He turned from the mountains and looked at her directly. His face was doing that thing it did when he decided something and was committed to the decision. Settled, a little tight around the jaw, but clear. "I want you to marry me," he said. "I want Rose to have my name, if you'd allow it. If that's something you'd want." He stopped himself from continuing, which she could see took effort. "I know that's a large thing to ask. After 2 months. I know it probably seems fast." She looked at him. She thought about the first evening, his face going cold, the order to leave, the snowstorm that had made leaving impossible. She thought about the note of his boots going up the stairs after the blizzard, counted one by one in the dark, the cradle by lantern light, 3 weeks of nights, his hands open and flat on the table. She thought about her mother's voice saying once, when she was about 16 and asking some question about how you knew things. You know the right things by how much peace comes with them. Not happiness, necessarily. Peace. They feel like they belong. She thought about standing at this back door in October with nothing but $4.60 and a 6-month-old and the remains of someone else's life. She thought about where she was standing now. "It doesn't seem fast," she said. "It seems like 2 months of paying attention." He held her gaze. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." Something happened in his face, not the dramatic relief of someone who'd been terrified of the answer, but something quieter. Like a tension releasing that had been there so long he'd stopped noticing it. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "All right," in his flat, practical voice. And the corner of his mouth moved in the way she'd come to understand was his equivalent of a full smile, and she laughed, actually laughed, a short, real sound. And he looked surprised by it, and then something that might have been close to laughing himself. "All right," he said again, and it meant something completely different the second time. They told Pete first because Pete deserved to be first. He was in the barn when Caleb found him, doing the morning horse check, and Caleb said it plainly. "Evelyn and I are going to be married." And Pete put down the brush he was using and looked at Caleb for a long moment with the face of a man who had been waiting for news and was deciding whether he was allowed to show how much he'd been waiting for it. "Well," Pete said. "Good." That was it. That was the whole response. But he held out his hand and Caleb took it, and they held the handshake a beat longer than the usual, and that was the rest of what needed saying between two men who'd worked together long enough to know each other's weight. Walt, when told, said, which from Walt was effusive. She wrote a letter that afternoon. She wrote it sitting at the kitchen table with Rose on her knee, and Rose kept grabbing for the pen, and she worked around her. And the letter went to no particular family member because she had none near enough to matter, but she wrote it anyway. Wrote it to the version of herself who had been sitting in the Denver room 8 months ago trying to figure out what came next. She wrote, I don't know if you could have imagined this. I couldn't from there. But it's real, and it's yours, and you got here by keeping going, which is the only way anyone gets anywhere. She folded the letter and kept it, because it was not the kind of letter you sent. Christmas came 3 days later, which was a quieter affair than she suspected the ranch usually produced with a full crew. She made a proper dinner, a roasted haunch of venison, carrots, and potatoes from the root bin, the last of the preserved apple from the pantry, cornbread that she made with a little extra honey because it was Christmas. Pete produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere that she suspected had been in his bunk since September. Walt made a contribution of dried apricots that he'd been hoarding since the last supply run, which he offered without explanation, as if dried apricots at Christmas were entirely natural and expected. They sat at the table, the 4 of them, 5, counting Rose, who was in Caleb's arms. He was holding her, which he had not done before. He'd been near her plenty, watched her, talked to her occasionally in the spare way he talked to everything. But this was different. Evelyn had handed Rose to him before dinner, simply, without ceremony, her hands full of the pot she was moving, and he'd taken her with the careful stiffness of someone who hadn't held many babies and was aware of the weight of the responsibility. Rose had regarded him with her usual solemn attention and then grabbed the collar of his shirt and held on, which was her standard approach to being held. And Caleb had adjusted his grip and settled her against his shoulder and looked across the kitchen at Evelyn with an expression she would keep for the rest of her life. It was not complicated, that expression. It was just a man holding a baby and understanding in the simple physical fact of it, something he hadn't understood before. At dinner, Pete raised his glass and said, "To the ranch," which was what he always said, she gathered, and then added, "and to the people who make it worth coming back to," which she was fairly sure was not what he always said. Walt said, "Hear that?" And they drank, and Rose made a sound from Evelyn's lap that was clearly her own form of contribution, and Caleb looked at the table and then at Evelyn, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, which was fine. The conversation at dinner was ordinary in the best way. Pete talked about the spring cattle schedule. Walt told one of his long stories about a horse he'd had 20 years ago, told it slowly and with great detail and no particular dramatic peak, which was exactly how Walt told all stories. Caleb talked about the fence plans for March. Evelyn talked about the kitchen garden along the south fence and what she thought would take in that soil, and Caleb said he'd have Tom and Cade clear the snow off that section when they got back so it could freeze properly over the winter, which was the right thing to do, and she was glad he knew it. After dinner, Pete and Walt went to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, and she washed the dishes while Caleb sat at the table with Rose, who had rallied after a post-dinner nap and was conducting her usual investigation of the available surfaces within reach. He was watching her with the attentiveness he brought to things he was still figuring out, patient, not performing. "She's going to walk soon," he said. "Pete says she's pulling herself up on things." "She is. Another month, maybe. She's going to get into everything." "Yes," Evelyn said. "She is." He was quiet for a moment. Do you mind that, when they start moving?" She turned to look at him. It was a genuine question, asked a little carefully, the question of someone who was learning what to ask. "I mind nothing about her," she said, "even the parts that are difficult." He nodded slowly. Rose grabbed his finger. "She does that," he said. "She does that," Evelyn confirmed. "She's done it since the first night," he said. "I remember thinking—" He stopped. "What?" He looked at Rose's small fist around his finger. "I remember thinking that she didn't know yet that I'd told her mother to leave, that she didn't have any information about the kind of person I was." He paused. "She just grabbed on." Evelyn dried her hands and came to sit across from him. "She's a good judge," she said, "or she isn't discriminating enough yet." "Maybe," Evelyn said, "but I think she knew something." He looked at her. "What?" "That you were going to be worth holding on to." He looked at the table. He turned her words over the way he turned coffee mugs, slowly examining them. Then he said, "I'm going to try to be. I don't know if I can promise more than trying." "Trying is the whole thing," she said. "Nobody gets to promise more than that." He looked up at her. Outside the kitchen window, the Christmas night was clear and very cold, and the stars were brilliant over the Montana range in the specific way that made you understand why people once thought they meant something. The fire was steady. Rose had released his finger and was now studying the edge of the table with deep concentration. This was not the life Evelyn had planned, because she'd stopped planning lives somewhere in Denver when planning seemed beside the point. It was the life that had arrived, difficult and real and complicated in all the ways that real things were complicated, and full in the way that only real things could be full. She had come to this place with nothing that mattered except her daughter and her ability to work. She had built the rest one morning at a time, one meal at a time, one evening in a cold kitchen at a time, by showing up and doing the thing that needed doing and not leaving when it was hard, which was, she'd come to believe, the entire secret of everything. Not brilliance, not luck, just the willingness to stay and work and be honest and stay some more. Caleb Mercer was not a simple man, and she did not want a simple man. He was going to infuriate her sometimes with his silences, and she was going to infuriate him sometimes with her refusal to back down from things she was right about, and they were going to have to learn each other the way you learned difficult terrain. Slowly, with attention, without expecting it to be easy. But she had looked at difficult terrain before and found it beautiful, and she thought that was probably the most useful thing about her. Spring would come, the crew would return, and Tom and Cade would want to know what had changed, and Danny would come back taller if she had to guess, and Reed would come back different in ways that would take the season to see clearly. The cattle would go to the upper range. The kitchen garden along the south fence would get planted. The broken things would get fixed, and new things would break, and that was the nature of ranches and the nature of everything. Rose would walk. She would fall down and get up, which was what Rose did, which was what all of them did. Evelyn Hartwell looked across the kitchen table at the man who was going to be her husband, who was watching her daughter examine the edge of the table with the serious attention he brought to everything worth watching, and she thought that this was what it felt like when surviving became living. Not a dramatic crossing, not a moment you could point to exactly, but this. An ordinary evening, a warm kitchen, a fire that someone else had built before you woke up. She reached across and put her hand over his. He turned his palm up, closed his fingers. Outside, the Montana winter lay vast and cold and starlit over everything. Inside, the house held them, all of them, every broken and stubborn and trying and imperfect one. And it held them like something that had been waiting a long time to be full.